Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. You can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 141 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on how does propaganda work? And this episode I really loved. I thought this was so great to research, and I'm so glad that I actually took the time that was to actually do today's podcast episode there was. So because of this, I'm actually really hopeful that the war in Ukraine will actually end a lot sooner than everyone thinks, and that these Western sanctions will actually really work. So propaganda, it's just such a great topic. And in today's episode, we're actually going to look at it, so I cannot recommend this great episode enough. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode, so you can always email me, connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment on the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast, and you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Social Psychology, a guide to social and cultural psychology, 3rd edition. And the reason why this book is a great sponsor for today's episode is because not only does this great book goes into so much depth about social psychology. For example, it looks like persuasion, inner groups and out groups, friendships, and so many other really gripping social psychology topics. But propaganda works by exploring different social psychology topics. So if you really want to have a much deeper understanding of the main concepts behind propaganda, then you really do need to buy this great book. I cannot recommend it enough. It's easy to understand, really interesting, and this is not a boring textbook in the slightest. So that is Social Psychology, a guide to cultural and social psychology, 3rd edition, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get the paperback, the hardback, and the large print version from Amazon at your local bookstore or local library if you request it. And now we're going to move on to the content part of today's episode. How does propaganda work? For the podcast's first ever political psychology episode, which I'm really pleased with, because political psychology is something we've never looked at before, so I'm really pleased to move into this newer field. So I wanted to investigate how propaganda works, since lots of people think propaganda is simply brainwashing people to believe in stuff, but it doesn't work like that. For example, there is evidence that even in Nazi Germany, the Nazi propaganda failed to convince lots of people of the Nazis' righteousness. However, propaganda can work sometimes, so that raises the critical question of how does propaganda work? But first of all, though, I actually want to say, why is it important to know about propaganda? So as I write this, or to be honest, I read this, in very late March 2022, is the Russian-Ukraine war, and it is extremely alarming that the majority of Russian people support the illegal invasion of Ukraine, since Russians believe that Ukraine is a major security threat to them, and they believe that NATO is an offensive alliance, which I really have to laugh at, simply because it is not how NATO works in the slightest. So nothing could be further from the truth. So it begs the question, how did Russia convince so many people to believe in such nonsense? Propaganda. Therefore, propaganda can work sometimes to influence people and control their behaviour. That's why propaganda is so critical to study in social and political psychology. In addition, effective propaganda works in 2 main ways. It increases support for the regime, and it confuses and disunifies the opposition. So in today's podcast episode, we're going to be looking at how does propaganda increase support for the regime. And then in between podcast episode, I'll talk about the second way. How does propaganda gather support for a regime? Quite simply, one of the most fundamental truths about propaganda is that it works for people who will want to believe it. For example, and of course, I'm not trying to get into politics here, I'm trying to keep firmly away, but it's good to use Western examples from time to time. But this is how Brexit propaganda works in the UK. The people who want to believe that Brexit works believes in the propaganda, but for people who don't believe it works, the propaganda doesn't affect them. In terms of psychology, propaganda offers what looks like the facts as well as the overall narratives that feeds into our motivated reasoning. And this motivated reasoning is quite ubiquitous, and it is our tendency to treat evidence selectively to justify our own beliefs that align with our preferences. And this motivational reasoning isn't specific to propaganda, because it turns out we actually use this quite regularly. For example, when we have to assess whether our beliefs are right, whether what we did was right or wrong, and if our work deserves more recognition than we got. Therefore, when it comes to thinking about what a country did was right or wrong, the citizens of that country have a preference to think that it is. So the propaganda can be very effective, since it provides the justification that the people want to believe in. So using the war example, the Russian people might not want to believe that their government invaded Ukraine out of some evil intent and they're breaking international law. So it is easier to imagine that Ukraine is the enemy with their so-called biological weapons. To be honest, I think the stuff that the Russians come out with is just quite funny, because it's so nonsense and it's so utterly false. Additionally, because propaganda works with our motivated reasoning, it works best when the regime using it can foster feelings of nationalism amongst their citizens and increases their national identity. As well as how we know from social psychology, our group identities are very, very strong and fierce when members of our group are in conflict with another group. And of course, this doesn't just apply to countries, it applies to all in-groups and out-groups, leading to cooperation to increase within the group and aggression to increase towards out-groups. Again, this only increases support for the government, because the citizens want to cooperate with their own group and hostile towards the out-group. As a result, by increasing and making closer bonds within a country, the government is able to support itself with the citizens' nationalistic feelings, and the government is less likely to be questioned because of their decisions. This is what all propaganda wants. And to be honest, support the propaganda creator and question them less. That sounds like code for my code psychology book, to be honest. But I'm sure if I actually went back and looked at that book again, I could definitely find some parallels between what Russia's doing now with its propaganda, what code leaders do. And something that I love about psychology is that there is a effect name for everything. So in terms of this propaganda topic, this effect is known as the rally around the flag effect. Also, it is known to favour leaders who see support increase in times of war, at least at first, and that's absolutely critical. Overall, the key goal of propaganda is to reinforce and create an us versus them narrative, along with the propaganda firmly reinforcing the message that the in-group is innocent, whilst at the same time repeating all the abominable and outrageous, real or fake, aggressions that the out-group has committed, leading to the messages having a very strong emotional impact on a country's population, and this fosters a willingness for the people to accept the propaganda. Using propaganda when a country's unpopular with its people. So now we're going to narrow down on how a country uses propaganda when it does something that is unpopular with its people. For example, lots of Russians don't like the government invading Ukraine, because the Russians and the Ukrainians have a very close relationship with each other. Therefore, propaganda can channel citizens through 3 steps to rationalise what's happening: denial, minimization, justification. When people are in the denial phase, propaganda can help people reject factual evidence and believe that it isn't happening. For example, there is no war in Ukraine, it's just a special military operation. In the minimization phase, as the factual evidence, like targeting a maternity hospital, becomes harder to ignore and outright reject, propaganda helps people minimize the problem. For example, there is a conflict, but it's limited to the capital or south of Ukraine. Lastly, in the justification phase, propaganda can be a great form at getting people to believe that the problem was needed, and they accept as well as support this new reality. For example, there is a war, but it was needed. The sad truth. If we turn slightly pessimistic for a moment and actually apply this understanding, It is a great shame that propaganda cannot be used effectively to change a population's factual perception and thus not generate massive opposition to a regime and their actions. For example, the invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, it isn't necessarily the case that the Russian people do disapprove of the war when the evidence of its reality becomes questionable. For example, in terms of the extreme inflation, the price of everything increasing, and the increase oppression that the Russians live under. How to stop propaganda working? If we want to stop propaganda from working, then we need to stop a person's motivated reasoning. This is where the cost, be it human, economic, or another type of a cost, increases to such a degree that the person's personal interests conflict with the war itself, because the war then becomes a problem to their personal interests. With that in mind, the quick around the flag effect, which happened after the invasion, and the Justification report that is on full display in many parts of Russian society, may slowly crumble, or really quickly, all because the huge cost of the war will move down onto Russian citizens. And to be honest, this is why Russian sanctions are so critical, because these Western sanctions are making life really difficult for the Russian oligarchs, the Russian people, were hopefully though very, very quickly they're going to realise, this war is really costing me dearly. I can't even afford to feed myself anymore. I cannot support this war anymore. So who knows what that's going to lead to? It might just be protests. It might be another Russian revolution. I don't know, to be honest. But we can only hope that eventually it will make the war stop. Conclusion. So please believe me when I say what's going on in the world is tough, horrible and scary. I am kind of innocent, but because I truly believe that we fear what we don't understand it, I believe that the only reason why I'm concerned about the Ukrainian war is simply because I don't understand it. But after this episode, I'm really hopeful of the future and what it could actually bring there, because now we know that the Western sanctions are critical for breaking people's motivated reasoning. So hopefully though, if these sanctions increase and continue, then there will be an end to the war in the future, and the war will not go past Ukraine, because that's one of the most dangerous things, is that the war spreads. And at least we know that propaganda can be stopped and undone. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and that you got something out of it. If you know someone who would like today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more about this great topic, then please just check out Social Psychology, A Guide to Social and Cultural Psychology. It's a great book that really does build up on today's episode. But if you didn't want to buy a book, but you're still wanting to give the podcast a bit one-time support, then you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whitesley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhitesley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhitesley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.